Mrs. Kyndley. Written and read by TARDIS9. Based on the Railway series by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten, and the annual stories Thomas and the Snowblock and Thomas and the Important Visitor by Christopher Awdry. Thomas the Tank Engine is very proud of his branch line. He puffs up and down it every day with his two coaches, Annie and Clarabelle. Every time they approach a station, there is always someone there to greet them, and Thomas always whistles, "Beep beep, hello," in return. Lots of people join the branch line at Elsbridge. Edward, Henry and James are often there to meet Thomas as he comes in. They are always very happy to meet up with Thomas and tell him all the news. One day, Thomas was waiting at the station for Edward's passenger train. He was late. "Beep, beep, beep," whistled Thomas crossly. "Where is that, Edward?" "Right here," came a stern voice. Thomas looked around and saw Edward coming up behind him. The old blue engine pulled up at the platform and looked at him. Crowds of passengers got out of Edward's coaches and climbed aboard Annie and Clarabelle. "I know you like keeping to time, Thomas," Edward said, "but you need to have more patience. Remember what happened with your guard? And the time you took your first passenger train?" Thomas's face fell. "Every one of these passengers is important," carried on Edward. "And every time we leave them behind, we let them down. Look at that couple there." Thomas looked to where Edward was gazing. A young married couple was climbing aboard Clarabelle, while the guard put their suitcases in her luggage van. "That young couple is just returning from their honeymoon in Brighton," said Edward. "Just imagine how they would feel if they missed their train because you wouldn't wait." Thomas said nothing. He could imagine how awful it would be for them. The guard blew his whistle and waved his green flag. Then, once he was aboard Clarabelle, Thomas puffed away. He puffed smoothly and gently along the line. "Nice and smooth, nice and smooth," sang Annie and Clarabelle. They passed by a field where Thomas saw a tractor with strange-looking wheels at work. He wondered what it was doing there, but couldn't stop. The signal was down, and he knew he couldn't hold up the line for the coffee pots with their stone trucks. He hurried on and soon reached Hackenbeck. The young couple walked up to him. "Hello," they said. "That was a very nice ride you gave us. Thank you very much." Thomas was flattered. You're welcome," he replied, unsure what else to say. "What's your name?" asked the lady, approaching him. She was slim, with chestnut brown hair and a face that showed nothing but kindness. "I'm Thomas, miss." "Mine's Kitty. Kitty Kyndley. My new husband and I have just bought a cottage somewhere near here. He's watched you at work on this line. And I have to say, you are without a doubt one of the hardest working engines I have ever seen," added her husband. Thomas smiled smugly at this. "Well, thank you, sir," he said. "I suppose I do have to work hard to keep this the best part of the whole railway." "And a wonderful job you do too," chuckled Mrs. Kyndley. "I've never had such a smooth ride before, and we rode on the express to our honeymoon." A cheeky grin crossed Thomas's face as he imagined what Gordon would have had to say about that. "We must be going now," said Mrs. Kyndley. "We've got lots to do, but our cottage is by the line side. We'll see you very soon." "Goodbye, nice to meet you," called Thomas. He smiled. These two passengers had left him feeling warm and cheerful. especially Mrs. Kyndley. He had a feeling he would be seeing her again soon. A few weeks later, the weather changed. Snow lay all about the countryside, covering the sleepers and ballast. Only the engine's snowplows saw to it that the rails remained mostly uncovered. But even then, the engines still had to contend with drifts on the line. Thomas sat in his shed, feeling cold, lonely, and miserable. He had just been pulled out of the snow by the tractor, who had earlier introduced himself as Terence, and had to stay in his shed until the workmen could come and clear the line for him. And that wouldn't be until the next day. He couldn't clear the snow. He had been very silly and broken his snowplow. And Terence couldn't be spared, since he had too much work to do on the farm, and the bigger engines couldn't help either. They were either far too heavy for the branch line or had far too much work to do. Thomas disliked this. It meant sitting in his shed and letting his passengers down. He knew that the local buses would replace his trains, but even then their journeys were significantly delayed by the foul weather. A blast of cold air struck Thomas's smokebox. The door opened. A familiar figure, dressed in winter clothing, appeared. Mrs. Kyndley approached Thomas and saw the downcast look on his face. "Hello," she said. "Why the long face?" Thomas told her what had happened that morning. "The thing is, I realise why my snowplow is so important now," he told her. "But I just feel terrible for letting the snow get the better of me. I let my passengers down just by not being there for them." "I see," said Mrs. Kyndley. She whispered something to the shedmaster. It's irregular," he said. "But I'm sure it won't do any harm. I'll just ask the Fat Controller." He picked up the telephone, dialed the number, and waited for a response. When he got one, he spent only 1 minute in conversation before placing the telephone down on the receiver. "He says, yes, you may," said the shedmaster. Mrs. Kyndley smiled. "Thank you," she said, and turned back to Thomas. She picked up a cloth and some polish and began cleaning him. "My mother used to work as a cleaner on the railways during the Great War," she explained. "I sometimes used to come and help her clean engines on the mainland after school. Besides," she went on with a chuckle, "I can never stand seeing an engine looking dirty when not at work. It makes me think too much of scrap." Thomas smiled. "You worked on the railways yourself then, I take it?" "Sort of," she said. "I was station announcer once at Brighton. It was a lovely place. Such beautiful buildings, the view from the pier, and the sheer vibrancy of the community all made it almost perfect. But sadly, I never got the chance to work with the engines themselves while I was there. Although, I did visit the workshops." "Did you?" Thomas asked incredulously. "Yes," Mrs. Kyndley replied. "My husband used to work there as one of their repair crews. He and the other workmen would always need to consult old designs to repair the engines. This would sometimes include the blueprints for engines such as you and your brothers when you were built there." Thomas was about to ask her another question, but she already knew what it was. "He would sometimes bring them to my apartment and show them to me," she explained. "I know a Billington need too when I see one." Thomas felt better for being with Mrs. Kyndley by now. She seemed to know this as she moved closer towards his smokebox. "Listen," she said, "you made a mistake, and now you're aware of the cost. But you have to move on. Snowplows won't always get through all drifts anyway. I know how highly you engines value your passengers, but that is why you need to carry on. If you don't do your best by them and learn from your mistakes, then you'll end up in nothing but trouble." She said no more as she finished her task. Thomas looked closely at her. Mrs. Kyndley seemed somewhat different to last time he had seen her. She looked tired and worn out more easily. There was a long silence while she tidied away the cleaning equipment. She opened the shed door and made to leave. At the door, she turned and said, "But I hope it doesn't come to that. I know a really useful engine when I see one too." She disappeared into the snow, closing the shed door behind her. Thomas sat in the shed, lost in thought over her parting words. "If I don't move on," he thought, "what will become of my branch line?" But then he thought a little more. "All this because I went without my snowplough." The days passed by. The line had been cleared and Christmas was approaching. Thomas found himself puffing up and down the line, taking produce in trucks and passengers in Annie and Clarabelle. All along the line, people were decorating their houses with lights and Christmas trees. It all looked very festive. When Thomas puffed past the Kyndleys' cottage, he could see them putting up decorations. Mr. Kyndley stood atop a ladder hanging up lights. Mrs. Kyndley stood at the bottom, holding them in a bundle for him. She heard Thomas whistle a greeting and turned and waved to him. Thomas looked closely at her. She was definitely looking rather tired, and she seemed to look larger than he had seen her before. "She's pregnant," said Terence simply. "That's why she's getting so tired." Terence had brought up some produce from the farm to be taken to the Christmas market. Thomas, still wondering about Mrs. Kyndley, had asked Terence what he made of everything while his trucks were being loaded. "She's what?" Thomas asked. "Pregnant," repeated Terence. "She's going to have a baby. People and animals don't get built like us, Thomas. They're born and they grow. It's all just part of nature. But having a baby is very tiring, you know. Just being pregnant can tire anyone more easily, as they use up a lot of energy to keep both themselves and their babies alive. And there are quite a few ways things can go wrong too. You won't believe how many animals we've had on a farm that've struggled to give birth." Thomas remained respectfully silent at this. "Well," chuckled Terence, "I never thought I'd see you silent at something you can't do." Ugh. Thomas said nothing, but looked down at his buffers in embarrassment. He knew what Terence was talking about. Terence could see his downcast look. "Look, don't beat yourself up about it," he said kindly. "We all need a bit of help sometimes, but we make mistakes when we don't ask for help, among other things. That's part of what Christmas is, you see, helping others who are less fortunate." The last crate was loaded onto the train, the farmhand closed the trailer, and Terence rumbled away, leaving Thomas once again deep in thought. Soon it was Christmas Eve. All over the island, the engines were working harder than ever to ensure all jobs were completed in time for Christmas Day. Any delay or cancellation would mean a backlog come the day after Boxing Day. Annie and Clarabelle were full of passengers, which they and Thomas carried to each and every station on the branch lines. Even the goods trains were kept busy, so much so that the troublesome trucks didn't even have time to do so much as hold their trains back. Not that they particularly cared, though. They were far too busy singing Christmas songs. Thomas dutifully kept to his work, determined to make sure it was all done. He was worried that something could go wrong for the Kyndleys, and that the birth of their child could end badly, so he wanted to be on hand in case they needed help. He had also thought over all that Terence and Mrs. Kyndley had told him, and decided to ask for help when he most needed it. He had long since realised how silly he had been, but had realised that the best way to go about it was to always keep his snowplough on in snowy weather and to accept help when required. However, it seems that he wouldn't get the chance. Every task given to him was one that he knew he could do alone. That evening, he sat in the shed. His work was finished for the day, and his crew were emptying out his firebox as he felt his boiler cool. In the distance, he could hear the church choir singing Away in a Manger. Normally, he would have enjoyed listening to the music, but he was still worried about Mrs. Kyndley.
I don't like it, he thought. I shouldn't be cooling down at a time like this.
Indeed, he was still in steam, but for how long? The baby was due very soon, but what if something happened? Mrs. Kyndley might still need help, and how could he come to her aid if all he did was sit in the shed all the time? But he didn't have time to contemplate all this for long. The shed door opened and a flurry of snow entered the building before the station master emerged, slamming the door shut behind him. "Get that engine back out there and get his snowplow on, quickly!" he barked to the crew. "Mrs. Kyndley's giving birth, but she's losing blood. Not only that, but there's also a snowstorm outside and the roads are blocked. Snowdrifts are everywhere. Thomas, we need you to get your snowplow back on and take the doctor to the Kyndley's cottage. The Fat Controllers agreed for the doctor to take the train to the cottage as a special, but you need to get going now." "Right," said the driver. He placed the headlamps to the special head code, while the fireman shoveled coal into the firebox once more. It was lucky the fire was still alight, otherwise raising steam would have taken longer. The station master turned to leave. Thomas thought back to the last time there had been heavy snow. He remembered how he had got stuck. He couldn't move a single inch. Every time his wheels spun, more snow would slip down and cover him until he was nearly buried. His crew and passengers were unhurt, but they weren't in the condition Mrs. Kyndley was in. If he got stuck this time, he might not make it, and she... Thomas shuddered violently at the prospect of the tragic outcome. Then, he remembered something both Mrs. Kyndley and Terence had told him earlier. He knew how foolish he had been to underestimate snow last time, and he was determined not to make the same mistake again.
"Sir," he called, "are the telephone lines still working?"
"Only just," said the station master.
"Then can you please send a message to Terence?" asked Thomas. "I don't know if I can get through the snow by myself. If Terence used his snowplow and helped to clear the snow by the tunnel on the other side, it would make the drift smaller, and I could get there quicker."
"I'll tell them right away," the station master exclaimed as he hurried out the door. Thomas's snowplow had luckily only just been mended, so it was soon fitted on. He buffered up to Annie and Clarabel, and they made their way to the station. The doctor scrambled on board Annie, and some workmen climbed into Clarabel with their tools, ready to help move the snowdrifts. The guard blew his whistle and shone his green lantern. With a will, Thomas's driver opened the regulator, and the rescue party stormed out of the station and into the snowstorm. It was hard work. As they approached the snowdrifts, they seemed to be getting deeper and deeper. The workmen got their tools, climbed out of Clarabel, and walked along the line, shoveling snow as fast as they could. At last, Thomas heard a familiar chugging noise.
"That's..."
He could see a shape moving towards him in the snow. It was a little tractor with an orange plough and caterpillar tracks.
Terence!
Peeped Thomas happily.
I've cleared what I could up to the cottage,
Terence explained.
I'm going to go back the other end and try pushing some more out, but it looks like it's up to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Terence, called Thomas, as Terence turned and headed back the way he came. The workmen dug at the drifts as fast as they could, and Thomas charged at them.
Come on, Clarabelle,
said Annie.
We've got to help too.
Right you are, Annie, agreed Clarabelle. So, banging their buffers, the two coaches pushed hard against Thomas, forcing him further through the snowdrift. They knew they might not be enough, but they refused to stand by and not help their friend. Everyone was tiring now. The wind swept through them all, and the colder it became, the more they all shivered. The workmen kept digging, and Thomas, Annie and Clarabelle kept pushing, but they were beginning to feel tired. But then, "There's the cottage!" called Thomas. The workmen stood back, and he, Annie and Clarabelle shunted back a few dozen meters. "Ready, Annie and Clarabelle?" Thomas asked.
"Oh, yes,"
replied Annie.
"We are,"
agreed Clarabelle.
"Now, what was it the trucks always say?
On! She and Annie cried together as they banged their buffers hard into Thomas while he ran forwards towards the snowdrift. Faster and faster they went until whoosh! In a great cloud of snow and steam, they charged straight at the snowdrift. It cleared away in an instant, and they stopped right outside the cottage. Mr. Kyndley had cleared a path from the railway to their front door and waited for the doctor to disembark. "Thank you, Thomas," he smiled before hurrying the doctor away. "Well done, everyone," the guard cheered. "But we couldn't have done it without Terence, though," smiled Thomas. "If he hadn't tackled the snow on the other side and pushed some off the top, we would have gotten stuck for certain." Ugh. Thomas and the workmen waited for the doctor. They didn't ask how everything went. They were all much too tired. But that night, Thomas was cooling down in his shed when he saw an unusual sight. There was Terence making his way along the rails towards him, towing a green trailer. And seated on a bench in the trailer was the Fat Controller.
"Well, Thomas," he said, "I've heard all about it. Thanks to you, the doctor was able to see Mrs. Kyndley. She's very weak and will have to stay in bed for a few days, but she will recover. Moreover, she has now given birth to a healthy baby girl who is doing very well indeed. I know Terence's part. He has proved himself to be a really useful tractor, and I shall see to it that he is rewarded. But you, Thomas, I understand, suggested we contact him, and came up with the idea of tackling the snow from both ends. That was some excellent thinking on your part, Thomas. Not only did you save a lot of time and effort, but in the true spirit of Christmas, you also responded to a call for help and let others assist you when you needed it most. You, Thomas, are a really useful engine."
"Thank you, sir," beamed Thomas.
"Now, I must be off," said the Fat Controller. "It's getting far too dark to be out here. Goodbye, and Merry Christmas."
Merry Christmas, Thomas and Terence said together. Both Christmas Day and Boxing Day soon passed by. One morning, Thomas was puffing along the line. He was taking some empty trucks to Farquhar for Gladys to take up to the quarry. As he passed through the tunnel at Hackenbeck, he could see the cottage, now cleared of snowdrifts. In an upstairs bedroom window, he could see two figures. A woman holding a very small baby in her arms. Mrs. Kyndley smiled and waved at Thomas, showing him her new daughter. He blew his whistle loudly in return.
Beep beep, Happy Christmas!
He called. Mrs. Kyndley never forgot that day. Several Christmases later, when she lay ill in bed, she heard a crash of earth. She then remembered that Christmas when her daughter, who she had named Katie, was born, and how hard everyone had worked to rescue them. So, she hung up her red dressing gown and was most relieved when he stopped just in time. She remained a great friend to the railway throughout her life, even attending their Christmas parties. Every day, when she was at home, she would often wave to the engines as they passed by. Sadly, she passed away in her sleep one bright day in February many years later. But even though she is gone, she is far from forgotten. Katie lives in the cottage now, along with her husband. Their children and their grandchildren often come to visit, and she tells them all about those Christmases so long ago. But the one Katie most prefers to tell is how two friends helped each other one cold, stormy winter at Christmas time. And whenever she has a moment, she too waves at the engines when they pass her, just as her mother used to so long ago. And the engines, in return, always blow their whistles, giving an extra special one at Christmas. I hope that this will continue, and that engines and people alike will never stop helping each other, especially at Christmas time. Don't you?